Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Berezin from MSDW. Thanks so much for joining us for today's session, focusing on how to elevate your audience strategy in D365 Customer Insights. Today's session is sponsored by our friends at Coffee and Done, and our presenters are Susanna Ramos and Jackie Hunt, both from Coffee and Done. So before we get started, I just want to mention two things. The first is that if you have any questions during the session, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and one of our presenters will get back to you via email after the session ends. And the second thing is that we are recording the session, and we'll have the video posted to MSDW within the next day or two. So without further delay, Susanna, I am going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. As Adam mentioned, my name is Susanna Ramos. I have been a marketer for almost 2 decades, the last 10 or so years of which have been really focused on marketing operations. So what we're going to talk about today is definitely my world. My day job, I lead the managed marketing services team at Coffee and Done. Jackie?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jackie. I have been in the digital marketing space for about a decade now. The last 5 years have been extremely focused on leading implementation projects for customer insights journeys, even sometimes for the Sales Hub application, for a slew of different clients across different industries. So definitely excited to share some of the things that we've learned about creating quality audiences with you guys today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackie. So yeah, for those of you who are not as familiar with Coffee and Done, we're a 12 plus year Microsoft CE partner. Now marketing has been our anchor, but as Jackie alluded to, we actually span the CE suite. So that includes sales and service as well. And that's everything from advising you on how to build the right CE roadmap to how that gets implemented in your favorite D365 products, right through post-build optimization. So today, we're going to focus in the marketing space specifically around audience management and really how to elevate your audience strategy, including how to do so in D365. So we're going to touch on a few things. First, just want to set the stage around kind of the ABCs of audience management. So the 3 kind of areas that you want to think about, the actions that you can take, the benefits of taking those actions, and conversely, the consequences of kind of ignoring some of those steps when you're thinking about your approach to audience management. We'll talk a bit about what makes a good audience, and we'll actually show some examples throughout the entire life cycle. And that's a really important point to make because marketing's job doesn't end when the lead, the ownership of that lead gets transferred over to sales. We will also talk about what that starts to look like in Dynamics 365 Customer Insights. So we'll talk a little bit about triggers, segments, the good, the bad, the in-between, the different types that you can see in the system. We'll talk about when to use those as well. So scenarios in which one may make a better fit than the other. And then we'll talk a little bit about some gotchas as you start to get familiar with those features in the tool. So let's jump right in. All right, so starting with the ABCs of audience management. So we'll start from the top with the letter A. A is for accuracy. Now, when we are thinking about really marketing efforts, certainly a campaign, the first thing that you're going to start with is a strategic objective, right? Whether that's events, whether that's accelerating sales readiness or re-engagement. Now, I'm sure if you talk to any salesperson or, a lot of marketers as well, we think of the objective as end game, right? Which is to either get net new business or to improve our retention. And that's true. But when we're thinking about campaigns and specific audiences at any given point, we try to think a little bit more narrowly, right? And so we're starting with that strategic objective anyway. Again, it could be anything from driving certain channel engagement, accelerating the sales process, whatever that looks like. And then that objective is what helps us kind of define what you need for some of the actions that you see here, right? So when we're thinking about things like clean data, impactful attributes, and this one is really important. When we are talking about impactful attributes, we're thinking beyond your job title or your role. And it's not to say that those don't have their place, but when we're thinking of what we would call real or kind of impactful attributes, we're thinking beyond demographic, right? Firmographic is a great example of something that doesn't necessarily get directly associated to the contact, but we're also thinking bigger, life cycle stage, preferences, even in the age of AI, predicted attributes like propensity to buy, right? So we're really trying to think beyond just those kind of standard attributes or demographic attributes, right? Those get included too, they have their place. And then we want to think about intent signals, right? So whether this is something as simple as some type of channel engagement, the way they are interacting with your emails, with the way that they're interacting on your site. And those intent signals, by the way, they don't just get captured in Dynamics 365 CI journeys. That's an important distinction. We'll talk more about that here in a second. But the data is really important. All of this data helps you define an audience with some precision, right? That kind of accuracy that we're looking for. And that accuracy helps you in a few different ways. So by reflecting the kind of real customer context, it helps you maximize engagement, it helps you improve your deliverability, and it ultimately helps build trust in your brand. Now, conversely, if we're thinking about the opposite of accurate, so inaccurate or maybe outdated audiences and how we're defining them, they kind of lead to the opposite, right? So you have mistargeted messages. If you are thinking about these audiences and how you use them for like paid channels, you're risking wasted spend. And you're also just risking disengaged customers, right? If it doesn't feel relevant with all of the information that's kind of being thrown at consumers on a regular basis, you have to make sure that you're kind of wading through all of the kind of garbage to get to what matters, which is your message. And so you want to make sure that it's going to be relevant. So when we think of accuracy, think of this as kind of the foundation for the right audience. All right, A is for accuracy, B is for balance. Now, when we think of balancing here, we're thinking about it through a few different lenses. If we think about kind of personalization and scale, we're thinking about how we can design audiences, segments, or triggers that are kind of specific enough to feel personal and kind of deliver that very personalized, kind of connected experience, but broad enough to deliver impact, right? So we don't want to move too far in either direction. So it needs to feel personal. It also needs to be scalable. Now, I would say maybe one exception to this is if you are following a certain ABM approach and maybe you're thinking about your top tier accounts where that audience is very established and you're really focusing on like true hyper personalization, then maybe that balance is a little weighted in one direction. But for the most part, we want to make sure that we are kind of maximizing our efficiency with a way that still allows us to deliver that kind of personalized message, right? So a little bit of balance on how we put these together, still want to be scalable, want it to be efficient, also want it to be human. So I talked about AI just before here and when we were talking about accuracy, but the same rings true when we're thinking about balance, right? It's really easy to jump on insert AI tool here, ChatGPT, Jasper, Claude, whatever it is, and just come up with the content quickly and not really think, right? But we want to make sure that it feels human. So whether that is in a conversational tone or whatever that looks like, again, we want to balance the efficiency and authenticity, especially now when your buyers are skewing so much further into millennial and Gen Z. I think they're like 3 out of every 4 of those buyers are in that category, and authenticity is a big deal for them. So we want to make sure that we're still keeping it human. And all right, so when we're thinking about the extreme one versus the other, you've got the over segmentation. And like I said, if you over segment, you're going to risk kind of fragmenting those efforts, right? Where we're getting too precise, too hyper focused, and then you end up having to do a whole lot more as a result. Whereas if we're under segmenting and we're again kind of moving in the opposite direction, you have generic messaging, right? So you want to find a balance to make sure that your campaigns are efficient, they're human, they're personal, but still scalable. All right. The third one, C, is for compliance. And this one is always a challenging one, right? So often when we are working with clients who are just starting to kind of maybe mature in the way that they manage or honor consent, it can be a hard conversation. Especially when we're thinking about the fact that a audience size can go from 10,000 to 100 as you are trying to focus on something like opt-ins. That's not an easy conversation to have, certainly not internally, right? And so we want to make sure that you're taking a measured approach, but compliance is very, very, very important, right? So at the end of the day, compliance helps build that credibility, which again, really important here. We want to build trust and protect that trust. It also helps to ensure that you're maximizing performance, right? So from a sender domain perspective, last thing you want to do is get a lot of negative engagement with something that you're sending out that could inadvertently jeopardize your sender reputation, right? It's also really important to think about compliance at every single step of the life cycle, right? So this is not just when someone is entering your system, but that consent changes. And that's not just for like the negative, it can also change for the positive, right? They may opt in to a certain topic in their preference center, or they may download a piece of content, and part of that download gives them the opportunity to get added to a particular kind of mailing list, if you will, right? So we also want to make sure that we are thinking about that throughout the entire life cycle as that continues to change. So we talk about compliance, being able to use that to build credibility, incorporating it at every step. There is a risk, when it comes to non-compliance. There's a study from, goodness, it's a few years ago. I think it's like 2018, 2017 from GlobalScape. And it talks about the risk when it comes to non-compliance, and it can be pretty steep. I think the study showed that it was like 2.7 times the cost when it comes to non-compliance. And that, that comes from a few different areas, right? So it's productivity losses, it's revenue losses, fees, fines, penalties, settlement costs, if you really get into it. And in some cases, depending on where your footprint is with your organization, like I said, those can be really steep. So whether you are just thinking about CAN-SPAM today, or you're thinking about Castle, if you have a Canadian footprint, CCPA in California, GDPR in Europe, whatever that looks like, there's a lot of different legislation out there. You have to take it into account when we're thinking about it. Compliance is really, really important, because the last thing we want to do is waste a bunch of money on non-compliance. That hurts our maximization, right, when we're thinking about those ROI efforts. So consent's got to be a really critical part of your marketing strategy, definitely your audience strategy as well, right? It's that responsible audience management that we want to make sure that we are keeping into account. It protects you, it protects the customer. Yeah. Okay, those are the ABCs. Let's talk about what makes a good audience. So I mentioned before, we talked about making sure that marketing is kind of involved at every step of the way. And that's really important, right? Because if we think about maybe a more traditional or outdated approach to a CE process, we think of this handoff, right? Where marketing gets them in the system, they get them to a certain place, and then they kind of throw it over the fence to sales, and then they take a step back. And in a modern process, that doesn't work. And candidly, marketing is far more valuable than that. It just evolves, right, as you get further and further into a buyer's journey. And so I want to show you some audiences here at each stage of the journey, just some examples. We'll talk about the kind of goal behind them and an example of what that audience would look like, with some highlights on where we're seeing really great audience points. So the first one is around early stage. In this case, we're thinking of kind of ready to qualify leads, right? So we have the purpose here is to convert those, get them in. We're seeing strong intent signals. And so you'll see a couple of those intent signals highlighted here. So we have an audience. It's contacts who have visited a demo page more than once in a certain amount of time and have downloaded a white paper, but don't yet have an open an opportunity in the system. And so the fact that they are visiting a specific page that is clearly showing a strong intent signal, and also the frequency in which they have visited that page, right? So it's not a one and done. They didn't bounce from the site after they landed on that page. They actually returned and continued to consume that content beyond the demo page by downloading the white paper, right? These are really strong intent signals that show you that someone is interested either in your thought leadership or hopefully your product or service. And so we have to think about those types of intent signals when we're starting to curate some of those audiences. All right, next example is a little bit more early to mid stage. So this one we're thinking about events, right? So think of an event focused kind of nurture campaign that we want to put together. Goal's pretty simple. We want to be able to drive attendance or engagement for this particular channel. So in this case, we're creating an audience of contacts in a certain area, and that may not necessarily be relevant depending on the topic or if it's in person versus virtual. But in this case, we're using a specific geo. They've attended an event like this in the past in a certain amount of time, and they have subscribed to event communication. So again, we're looking for that balance. We're not going too broad by saying all of these contacts that live in a certain area. We're trying to pare that down a little bit and increase the relevance. So we're also looking for folks who have engaged similarly in the past. And so we're using that impactful attribute around their location, combining that with an intent signal that shows previous engagement and a change in consent where we see that they are subscribed to this exact topic, right? So again, a good mix here of intent signals and attributes that we can use to kind of curate that audience and invite them to the next event. Now, we talked about segments and the way that segments can be kind of, curated here, but it's important to know that audiences are not just segment-based, right? This is where triggers come in. And the goal here is to react to the behavior or those kind of intent signals in near real time. So I've got some examples here. In this case, we have a prospect or customer that's completing an assessment or a quiz that you may have on your site. That's a strong intent signal that someone's willing to put in the time to do that. If they are looking at a certain page, but they abandon before they fill out the form or complete the purchase, again, a strong intent signal related to interest. And we are combining some where we have like the activity that's happening in dynamics. So in this case, they're hitting a specific milestone. So they're starting to progress in the life cycle kind of process. And so a new opportunity gets created from that qualified lead, and there is a specific product interest. And that could be from a number of different ways. In some cases, we have clients who they will capture that interest at the initial form because it's a specific, download, or it's a specific field that's capturing that interest. In other cases, your sales team may be getting involved early, and they don't necessarily create that opportunity until contact has been made, at which point they may have captured the product interest as well. So there are a few different ways that you can capture it. But the bigger message here is, again, we're looking for intent signals. We're looking for activity in the system that is showing a progression through the life cycle stages, and then anything that's showing preferences, anything like that, we're also using that attribute as well. Okay, we've got early, we've got mid. As I mentioned, marketing continues to be involved. So in this case, we've got something around the ability to kind of accelerate their sales cycle, right? So we want to validate using a case study that is something that they would be sending like later on. And I do want to pause here for a second, not get too far down a tangent. But when we think of content, think of a campaign wheel, right? You've got strategy, your audience, your messaging, your channels, the timing in which you are using those channels or executing on them, and then the analysis. And we kind of rinse and repeat, right? So the audience is heavily influencing the messaging, right? And so if there is an opportunity for us to kind of match a certain content type or, format or certain topic, we want to make sure that we're doing that, as well as mapping that to the right life cycle stage. So something like a case study can be really impactful, but if this is a buyer that is earlier on in their journey, the case study may not necessarily have the same impact because they don't yet know that there's a problem that you could solve. Right. So again, in this scenario, we're thinking later stage, we want to validate what maybe the salesperson or they are seeing elsewhere as they are trying to validate that you are the right solution to solve their pain points. So to send that case study, we want to look for an audience here that has contacts with open opportunities for a specific product. So again, that's because we're matching the case study. And we want to do that for those who have been in a certain stage. Now, here we put present, propose, but that could be whatever stage that you have identified as part of your CE process in the system, but that have been kind of stuck in one stage for a certain amount of time, right? So we're trying to reignite those kind of not stale, but stagnant opportunities and try and get them over the finish line by helping to kind of build some of that muscle memory and send messaging that validates what they may have been hearing throughout the process, right? So in this case, the contacts with open opportunities, that's an impactful attribute in the system. And then the life cycle stage, again, that we're touching on here. So using that milestone and leveraging that to kind of pare down the audience. All right, we've got folks who are in the system. They have made it through. You've won the business. The fun does not stop there, right? So part of that life cycle is well beyond the purchase, right? And so when we think of post-conversion, I've got two examples here. One is around looking for cross or upsell viability. So let's say we wanted to be able to gather any feedback or insights to kind of explore additional opportunities. And so in this case, the audience is customers with an NPS score over a certain threshold. So we know these are either, we'll either consider them neutral or advocates, and have actually opened a customer service email, or the majority of them within a given amount of time. And again, keep in mind the frequency here, things like that, all of that should be refined based on the length of your sales cycle. But the point here is we're using the NPS score as one of those impactful attributes, and then we're taking some of the engagement around specific types of communication and using that to create that relevance. One last one we have, and this one is around churn. So if you deal with churn or you're concerned with your retention rates, this one could be good for you. So in this case, we want to re-engage customers that have low utilization so that we can try and prevent that churn. So we're creating an audience of customers who have made a purchase within a certain amount of time, but who haven't really engaged much since. So if you are in the commerce space, maybe they haven't been on your site and looked at other products in the last month or however long. If you're looking at this more B2B, maybe they're not actually using the product. And so you're monitoring usage and you're not necessarily seeing a lot of engagement with the product in a certain amount of time. So in this case, we're taking the transaction and we're marrying that with an intent signal, in this case, a negative one. And we're using that to kind of curate the audience so that we can send them something. Maybe it's an incentive or similar to get them to re-engage. So these are just a few examples of audiences, what makes them good. Again, the big message here is that we want to make sure that we are moving beyond just simple attributes or demographic attributes. We want to think about the accuracy. We want to think about the balance, and we want to make sure that we are honoring consent and capturing and honoring consent so that we can continue to build that kind of credibility. All of that is data, right? And so that's really what it comes down to when we're creating and executing on those audiences. We need to have good data. And I put this graphic in here because I think it's important to know that that data is not just CIJ data or data that lives in Dataverse, right? So For those of you who are becoming more familiar with customer insights, it has two parts, right? There is customer insights journeys, and this is where you're going to see a lot of that journey orchestration. And then there's customer insights data. And this is the kind of customer data platform, or CDP. And that really allows you to take all of these data sources that live outside of Dataverse. So your loyalty, your product usage, your web intelligence beyond just views and sessions. There's so much. You can see a lot of them here. But being able to take all of those different data sources, loyalty, there's so many. Being able to pull that data in, kind of unify that data into that unified profile. But then the beauty here is that you can actually use that to create audiences that can then be used in CI journeys, right? So again, the data may not necessarily originate from Dataverse, but we are taking into account all of the engagement that is happening outside of it as well, and then leveraging that data to create those relevant audiences so that we can send them personalized communication. So again, it all comes down to data, but that doesn't just have to be the data that lives on your contact or lead. Yeah. Okay. I think that I'm going to turn it over maybe to Jackie, and we'll go through segments and triggers. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in the system. Yeah.
Yes, we will. Thank you, Susanna. All right. So I am going to dive into really, when are the right scenarios to use a segment versus a trigger? What are the useful ways that we can use segments or triggers in the system? And again, as mentioned, we're going to talk about some of the gotchas that we at Coffee and Done have ran into along the way in our years in the system. And we're going to share them with you guys today so that hopefully we can prepare you for some of those gotchas before you run into them yourself. So
learn from our mistakes. Yeah.
Yes, please. All right. So I'm going to start with talking about choosing your fighter as it relates to triggers or segments. So today, segments certainly still make sense in some cases. So for instance, when there's a multitude of different conditions, either on the contact record or the lead record, or even related data records that need to be met in order for your audience members to qualify for your segment. Segments are going to allow you to include all of those different conditions at one time in one place. So users are going to want to use segments when either dates or time frames need to be considered in the audience criteria. A good example of that could be maybe you want to suppress anyone who hasn't opened one of your company's emails in the last 6 months from a promotion that you're running because they're not necessarily engaged with your brand. But maybe later we'll want to run a re-engagement campaign that includes anyone who hasn't opened one of your emails in the last year or so. So great way to use time frames to pull the right people. But segments are also going to come in handy when a user wants to really understand the full size or scope of the audience that they plan to target. And if they want to target and engage that entire audience at precisely the same time, that is when segments are going to be the fighter that you want to choose in CIJ. Some of the good, the bad, and the in-between for segments. In CIJ, the segment builder does allow for that flexibility in the audience criteria. Yes, this is going to enable marketers to really drill into those targeted audiences. But there's also data that lives on customer records, but data that is related to the customer record, and even times behavioral data can be leveraged in dynamic segments in order to create your targeted audience. So with that said, though your audience conditions can be truly targeted in that way, users should keep in mind that audience membership in segments doesn't necessarily update instantaneously, but instead membership refresh follows a bit of a cadence, even when the segment is being used in an active journey. So there's going to be different periods of delay in membership refresh, depending on what the segment is, what type of segment it is, and if or where it's being used. So we'll definitely get into that a little bit deeper as we go on. But yeah, segments are a great way to really group those audience members together, really allowing for that shared experience among those qualified customers. But again, just a reminder, segments are not necessarily going to allow for a unique experience for the individual customer. But that being said, that brings me to triggers, because that's where triggers are going to come in useful, right? So I want to chat a bit about event-based triggers, but I first just want to be sure that I'm clear on exactly what I mean by event-based. So an event-based trigger, it's not really limited to actual event records that exist in Dynamics, so such as webinar attendance or event registrations, and though triggers can be used in these scenarios, an event can be considered really any action that's taken by a customer that's going to result in either new or updated data in Dynamics. So a few good examples could range from a customer submitting a marketing form, a customer submitting a survey response, or even simply just visiting a page on your website. So event-based triggers are going to be a great way to engage with your customers in real time based on actions that they take that are related to your products and services. Event-based triggers. Marketers can use these in ways to confirm that a marketing form submission was successful, or that a purchase that they made on your website was in fact received. Event-based triggers can help marketers really continue to engage with their customers who have recently interacted with their brand in one way or another. So it's good to know also, and I believe Susanna mentioned this previously, but a combination of both segments and triggers can be used within a journey, and it really helps you create a more innovative, tailored way to provide an experience for your customer. And it's not just going to be based off of who they are, but really how and when they interact with your brand. So, of course, bringing both of the tools together is your best possible option. Okay, so good and the bad and the ugly for triggers. So though triggers don't allow you to target customers in larger audiences all at the same time, for instance, if you are broadly announcing a new product, you're probably going to want to use a segment to get that message across to as many people as you can. But triggers are a great tool to leverage, really to truly engage with your customers in real time, ensuring a closer, more personalized relationship with your individual customers.
Oh, you know what? I did actually think of something, Jackie, while I've been like constant with my water as well. I did actually think of something, which is around marketing lists. So I know obviously we're talking about segments and triggers here. I know we still have some folks who still use marketing lists. And so I don't know if it's worth talking about maybe how those can also be used.
Yeah, definitely. So I know a lot of customers still are looking to use marketing lists. Sorry, my voice. Losing it.
It's all right.
Ooh.
All right there.
Oh, my voice is gone.
Oh no.
Yeah, but marketing lists, they can definitely be used in lieu of a dynamic segment or a trigger. So we have a lot of clients that actually ask us this question: can they still use the marketing lists that exist in their system today? So you can actually create a dynamic segment that looks directly to a marketing list. So you can sort of recreate that situation that you have going on today and just recreate that in Dynamics moving forward as well. When it comes to triggers can actually be used to continue contacting or maybe even stop contacting a customer where and when it makes sense. So depending on their interaction or their lack of interaction with your marketing materials, you can make a decision to either send them down a path of a more personalized customer experience, or you can actually remove them from continuing to target them as well if they're not interacting with the messages that you're sending them today. Okay, so going back to segments, I want to highlight how segments can be quite useful to marketers in dynamics. So as previously mentioned, if dates or time frames are a necessary consideration in order to qualify your customers for your audience, segmentation is definitely going to be your tool of choice here. So the segmentation tool in Customer Insights Journeys allows marketers to leverage what are considered exact, partial, or relative dates in order to qualify customers when it makes sense. So an example of using an exact date could be if marketers want to somehow engage or maybe provide a promotion to a customer who signed up for a membership on a very specific day. You're going to want to use that exact date. A good use case for a partial date capability could be to send your customers maybe a happy birthday email every year. But to do so, you're definitely not going to want the system to take into consideration the exact year that it is to send this type of email. So really, you only want the system to look at a partial date, and that would be the month and the day. And finally, the use of relative dates. So this could mean really only targeting customers who have opened one of your company's emails maybe in the last 6 months or so. So it is really important for users to understand the flexibility of these time frame conditions, just to make sure that you're being, as savvy as possible when you are setting up the conditions for your audience. All right. Natural language. So I'm always an advocate for keeping natural language in mind when you're designing your dynamic segment. So if you're not really sure where to start when you begin building your segment, definitely give the natural language feature a try just to get started. So just simply explain to dynamics in your own words what your ideal customer would be, and allow the system to interpret that into conditions in your segment. So though this feature is a great way to get started, or if you're looking for more of a simple query, but just keep in mind that the more complex that your organization's data structure is, the less likely that the conditions that come out are going to be exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Okay, road rules. So here are some road rules to remember regarding how often the following 4 types of segments refresh their membership in Dynamics. Oh, my voice is killing me.
Sorry, I'm like obsessed with this meme here, road rules. I feel like I'm aging myself. I don't know how many people actually remember this show. R.I.P. MTV.
I love it. All right, so if you have a segment that's not being used in a journey, that's going to refresh every 30 minutes for the first day that it exists. But after this, it's going to transition to a refresh cadence of every 24 hours. Whew. If we have a segment that's actively being used in a journey but does not include interaction filters, this type of segment is going to refresh about every 30 minutes. If you have a segment that is being used in a journey but does include one of those interaction filters, that segment's going to refresh every 60 minutes or so. And the last type is a segment that was previously used in a journey but is no longer being utilized. The refresh cadence for that type of segment is going to move back to once every 24 hours. So marketers are definitely going to want to keep in mind these refresh cadences when they're designing their journey, just to make sure that they're aware of whether or not the segment that they're using in their journey is as up to date and as refreshed as possible, depending on whatever capacity you're using it in. All right, so today the Journey Designer in Customer Insights Journey does allow for marketers to include more than one audience segment at the start of the journey. So though this can make creating journeys a little bit easier if there are pre-existing segments that need to be used. It's definitely going to save you from having to recreate the segment, but it is important to remember that the journey is going to intake any customer that qualifies for either one segment or the other. So you can kind of think of it as an OR operator being used in between the segments. So a customer doesn't have to necessarily qualify for all of the conditions in every segment. It's just going to be one or the other.
So Jackie, actually one point here, because I know like when you, obviously you're going to make your segment, you're going to feel really good about it, but maybe you need to change the conditions or something like after you've already set the journey live, but you still have that flexibility here, right?
Actually, no. If you notice a mistake in one of the segments that you're using in a journey that you've already gone live with, it's very important for users to keep in mind that you actually don't have the ability to go back and make edits to that segment while it's being used in a live journey. So we definitely urge users to be very careful and prescriptive when they are creating the conditions in their segment, and even think about future-proofing it, especially if your journey is going to be live for an extended period of time. Really make sure that the conditions that you have in your audience are correct from the start, because you can't really go back and make edits to them once that journey does go live.
It was wishful thinking for me.
Yeah. All right, so I want to talk about triggers in the Journey Builder. So in the actual Journey Builder, users have the ability to add additional conditions to their trigger that's being used to make it more specific to the journey's intent. So a good example of doing this is going to be if you want to remove or add a customer to the journey if they register for an event, but not just any event that might be taking place. You only want to qualify the customer if they register for the Fall 2025 webinar event. So adding additional data requirements to the trigger really helps fine tune the audience and make sure that you're really only pulling in customers or removing customers when it makes sense for the journey that they're in. And the cool thing is that triggers aren't actually limited for use in journeys, but can actually be leveraged and used in automations that are created throughout Dynamics. So triggers can kick off what we'd call cloud flows that provide a great way for marketers to actually collaborate with other internal team members. So these types of flows that I'm talking about can actually send internal Outlook or Teams notifications. They can even create task activities in the system that are really going to prompt other users to reach out and engage with their customers at a time that actually makes sense.
So when we are thinking about whether or not to use a segment or a trigger when you're starting the journey, and you do have to kind of choose at the start one or the other, right? So you have your segment-based journeys, you have your trigger-based journeys. A good question to use as a starting point is this based on customer attributes or any type of known data? And that's important, right? So we're thinking about any historical data that you have in the system, any patterns that you have already seen from things like previous engagement and the like. And so if the answer to that is yes, then segments may make more sense. So a couple of examples that you see here, if you have contacts that live within a certain geo, if you have leads that have reached a certain threshold, or customers who have previous transactions with you. And I think we used this in an example before where you want to be able to re-engage, right? Even customers that have maybe upcoming renewals, so you know when that contract end date is. All of that historical information can be really good for when to use a segment, because segments are great when you are trying to build these kind of defined point in time audiences, or if you're trying to use them for very intentionally scheduled campaigns. So maybe you want to invite only certain people, going back to one of the examples that we showed before, maybe you only want to invite certain people to a given event, right? And so a segment can be really good to kind of put together that initial audience to be able to send that invitation. Now, conversely, if it's not known data, this is where you can use triggers, right? And so in some ways you can think of segmentation being a greater fit for historical and triggers being a great fit for things that will happen. So behavior or certain activity that will happen that can then be used to activate certain communication. So some examples that we have here, form submission. So let's say they download a piece of gated content, or they submit a contact us form. That one feels like an obvious one. Or some type of channel engagement. So if they engage with an email in a certain way. Same deal for the abandoned cart scenario that we talked about before, right? Where they're visiting a website, but after a certain amount of time, they haven't completed the purchase or converted. And then finally, like I mentioned before, any changes in consent, really good opportunity to use a trigger. And that can be positive or negative, right? So if they have opted out, maybe you want to send a confirmation letting them know that they have been opted out of that communication. Conversely, if they are opting in and expressing interest, that can then be used to add them to a nurture campaign. And so you may want an email to go out when they have updated the consent and let you know that they are interested, to kind of start them on that journey, right? So a few examples here of where triggers can be really useful. Ultimately, again, think about triggers, using them to respond to near real-time behavior. Whenever you have something that maybe is more transactional in nature or a little more time sensitive, triggers can also potentially be used. And then if you're looking again for that instant personalization. So we talked about for segments, if you're using this to send an initial invite, maybe the actual event registration can be kicked off using a trigger for that, right? So again, we're sending that immediate communication, letting them know that they are in fact registered for the event. Or in the case of the gated content, let's say they download a white paper, we want to be able to either send the white paper directly if they didn't redirect to that on the form, or we wanted to use that to kick off a journey where we're sending them additional content around that topic, right? So you have a few different options here. Now, if you're like our friend Rodney in the middle here and you're not really sure, as we mentioned, remember, both can coexist, right? So again, think of segments as defining the who in this scenario, and you're using the known data to be able to do that. Think of triggers as the when and the why. So when they submit a certain form, because they have engaged with a certain channel or a certain email, or because they abandoned before conversion, or because they have, again, updated their preferences, right? So you can use both when it makes the most sense. But just wanted to put something together to kind of get you at a starting point if you're trying to understand when it makes more sense to use a segment versus a trigger.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about some gotchas. And we're going to start with gotchas for segments. The first one I want to touch on is if your audience conditions rely on data that isn't stored directly on the customer record, users are going to need to make sure that that related table that houses the records that you need to use, or the data that you want to leverage to create your dynamic audiences, is actually synced within the segmentation tool. So in order to start leveraging that data, you need to make sure, again, that you add it and get it synced in. So if you're trying to build your segment and you don't see the record type that you're looking for when you're adding an attribute condition to your dynamic segment, take a double check, make sure that maybe you need to actually get that table synced into the segment tool, and then you can go ahead and start leveraging that data. All right, I quickly want to touch on operators in groups. So it's useful to keep in mind that operators that are used within segment groupings are required to remain consistent throughout the entire group. Now, if you separate out the conditions within a grouping, then you have the ability to control the operators individually, but never when they're within the same group themselves. So if you can't get one of the operators to flip individually, this is going to be why, probably. Quick tip on estimate members. So this is a feature in the segmentation tool. It's going to kick back membership or counts for your segment. And although users are always going to see the estimate members option available in the segment tool, this feature is actually not going to return any estimated members when behavioral conditions are included in the segment logic. So you can see in our little close-up bubble here on the screen, you're actually going to see a kickback notification that a preview of membership is not available for behavioral groups. So if you can't get your segment to provide membership or accounts, this is probably why. So take a closer look. If you see behavioral conditions in there, you're unfortunately not going to get any membership sent back. Okay, so if you want a trigger in Customer Insights Journeys that listens for changes to the data that lives outside of the contact or the lead record, it's important to understand that that data needs to be in some way connected back to the customer record. So without that connection, the trigger is actually not going to work in a journey to help you engage with the customer. So once that relationship is set up between the customer record and the data that you do want to leverage, you can then use that trigger that listens for changes to that related data to design a journey that is a bit more tailored based off of changes to that related data. So relationship first, and then you can leverage the related data in a trigger.
And so I know we talked about this again, like the types of data that you can use for segmentation doesn't just have to live in Dataverse if you are using CI data and kind of pulling in those additional sources and creating the segment from there. Are triggers limited to Dataverse data or changes within the Dataverse?
They're not actually. We have what are called custom triggers. So yes, there are triggers that are based off of Dataverse data, but we have custom triggers too. Dataverse triggers are a great no-code way to create those triggers for changes to data in the system. But when you're using a custom trigger to capture interactions that your customers or engagement that your customers are displaying maybe on your website, maybe they visited a web page or clicked through a web page, maybe they abandoned their cart, you're going to want to use a custom trigger. But that is going to take a little bit more of development on the website. So just a heads up there, it's not necessarily a no-code solution. So you may need to get your web developer involved in order to add just a small snippet of code to the website so that you can start tracking those interactions on your site. And then leveraging them in customer journeys. Okay. Another gotcha. So today there are out-of-the-box triggers that are provided by Microsoft that are directly related to customer voice. But today you're actually not going to find these for use in real-time journeys. But don't worry, there is a workaround that we came up with. So triggers that listen for customer voice survey responses can actually be rebuilt to replicate the out-of-the-box triggers. So if you're looking to pull a customer into a journey, or tailor your journey to a customer survey submission, you can still make that happen today. You just need to recreate those out-of-the-box triggers.
Awesome. Well, look, we went through a lot today related to audiences, elevating your audience strategy, and better understanding audience management. But remember, start with your ABCs: accuracy, balance, and compliance. And look, we talked about this, but data is king here, right? So your audience is only going to be as good as the data that you're working with. And again, that doesn't just mean that you're confined to the data within Dataverse. So if you have additional data sources outside and you want to connect that through CI data, you can then use it to create those audiences and use them back in CI journeys. And then again, your audience can be a segment, it can be a trigger. So think of the who versus the when and why, or it could be a combination of both. Yeah. So thank you so much. If you made it this far, there's lots more resources that you can check out on audiences, segmentation, features, and CI, and so much more on our blog. And if you're looking for continuing education, our Knowledge Hub is also available, chock full of video-based courses and one-on-one time even with C&D SMEs on a variety of topics, including audiences. So thank you so much for watching, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.